So let me give you a couple things. Here's a simple way, if you have got the technology, to get all the slides, and it'll also send you an entire 6-lesson digital curriculum that you can use, and introduce you to some of the stuff on our platform. You just text the word canoeing to that number. Notice 66866. That's too many sixes for a pastor. I got to tell you right there. Just thank God for that 8 right in the middle of it. It'll give you that resource. And if you have trouble with, has anybody tried it yet? Is it? You're trying? Let me just tell me. I want to know if it works. It does. Okay, good. So you get a link. So what you'll get is you'll get a link. You just give us your name and email, and they send you some stuff back. You'll get the slide deck, the whole complete slide deck, and you'll also get a link to a 6-lesson digital curriculum we built that you might be able to even use in some of the different places that you found yourself. The curriculums can be used even in the stuff that I've given him to Clark to be able to use in those peer learning groups, which I just think is amazing. The entire thing was built so a person could do it by themselves, or even better in a group, because it's built around the whole notion that if you need relationships to bring change, you should have relationships to lead change. So it's built around those notions as well. So that should be helpful. If nothing else, you can take a picture of this and you can try that later. And I will also send on to Clark a couple of other things that he can just send to you that you can just access, that you try them out for free. If you want them, you can sign up for them. So partly, this is actually one of the ways that we learn a lot, actually, from Fuller. At Fuller, our entire intent is to listen to, I get a very amazing privilege, which is that I get the chance to leverage our scholars and research toward problems that actually people in the church want to have addressed. I don't have to worry about building a curriculum. I can actually ask you, what do you need? And we can build stuff for you. So for example, we just launched this thing called Fuller Equip that gives you professional certificates that you can earn from Fuller. One in the essentials of ministry, another one in church planting, and we built it with our church planting folks. So over the time that you take the courses, you can actually build out an entire plan for developing a church plant, and it's all available without having to sign up for master's level tuition and stuff. So it's like that. So this afternoon, I want to be clear about this. I know the challenge of the afternoon, and God can change your life in the afternoon. I was going to be a national park ranger, but I took biology after lunch, and then slept through most of that and didn't get a very good grade and ended up being a pastor instead. So since I am a Presbyterian, I believe that was preordained from the beginning of time, but I'm conscious of the fact that trying to compete with fried chicken and pie could be an uphill battle. So I'm going to do my best. And we're going to do a little shorter segments. And some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today is going to be meant to be things that you can build on and you can grow from as we talk about this next piece. So I told you that my life was changed literally by hearing from a group of Methodists and then hearing this resonance of, that happened wherever I'd go around the country when I was working on the Presbyterian Mid-Council Commission, and then as a consultant, where pastors told me, I just don't believe I've been trained for this world. It was the exact same thing that Fuller heard. So now there's a second whisper that I've been hearing in the last 5 years. I've gone into places, I've done these seminars in lots of places. I'm consciously aware that the irony of being a person who teaches about adaptive leadership, how often just bringing me can be a technical solution. We've learned that. What a good idea. Now let's see, what can we get next week? But what I've become really aware of is that the struggle in adaptive leadership is actually not the technique. It's pretty easy, and not even the concepts. Once we get them in our head, it's actually doing the work. It's hard work to step into the work of helping people deal with loss and helping people deal with change when they're so resistant. And I actually had it was a Methodist district superintendent who said to me after I'd finished a whole long day, and he said, I just have this feeling that we don't have anyone who can actually do this. Said, we don't have a very deep bench and we don't have a whole lot of folks. I just wonder if how many of our people, they're tired, they've been stressed, they've been working hard, you're asking them to do something really, really hard. And so what does it take for us to become the kinds of people who develop what Ronald Heifetz calls adaptive capacity? And how do we build adaptive capacity into our congregations and into our leadership teams as well? One of the ways to think about it is this way. When I go consult places, we'll often use this phrase: the organization is stuck where the leadership is stuck. And that's the good news. Why is that good news? Because all we got to do is work on the leadership. We either need to get new leadership, change it that way, or if we're the ones in leadership, change ourselves. But if you focus on our own transformation, And if we focus on our own change and stay connected to the people that we're trying to transform, then we'll find transformation happens. You actually don't need to nag people into change. It doesn't work anyway, right? Right? You don't have to try to change anybody. That's not the goal. The goal is to lead a change process that begins in your own transformation. So leadership is energizing a community toward their own transformation in order to accomplish a shared mission in the face of a changing world. And that transformation begins by my owning my own part in it. So in the book, I talk about this, call this transformational leadership, and it's built on first technical competence. And what I say about that is I want you to know that the technical competence, the things you have been trained for, actually are of value. They're not going to take you into uncharted territory, but they are the first part of the journey that people need to follow you through to be ready to go off the map. So very often, I can't tell you how many times I've had my book has been picked up by some young pastor who tweets out, I think for his session to see, it's usually a Presbyterian, it's like, we need to be able to adventure off the map. And then one time, I actually had someone tweet back from his session, when trust is lost, the journey is over, right? And I'm watching and I'm thinking, well, this is interesting. I've never been in the middle of a Twitter storm, right? But it's really true. Like the way you build trust on the map. When people come to me and they'll say, look, I think I want to lead the congregation in an adaptive challenge and an adaptive change, and I go talk to their congregation, their leaders will say stuff like, if they would just preach better. Well, we should try that. Or if he would just show up and show the congregation he cares, that would help, right? Right? So many of us are so excited about the change that we don't realize that we haven't developed the trust. And so trust is formed in the credibility of technical competence and then affirmed in the trust that comes from relational congruence. So you have to do a good job with people and souls, with souls and communities, right? Individuals and communities. You have to do a good job with tasks and with teams. If you run bad meetings, and they're just insufferable and people can't make your say through them, or you use the meeting to do nothing but have a captive audience listen to you talk, or if you lead in such a way that people don't feel as if you are competent, then they're not going to follow you off the map. They're not going to follow you when you say, hey, we have to change. So it starts in that competence, and it also starts in being congruent. And notice the phrase, technical competence. You don't have to be the best preacher in the whole world. You have to be competent. You have to be trustworthy with the texts, with our traditions, with leading people, right? You don't have to be the most attuned, psychotherapist. You've got to be a good listener. There's got to be a kind of threshold competence. And relational congruence is a way of saying you don't have to be a perfectly attuned, empathic, loving, 100%, able to care for every person. You just have to be the same person showing up the same way at every place you go. People have to have a sense that they are meeting the person who is the same wherever they find them. That you are that's actually the same person. And you've all had this experience, right? We moved into a new neighborhood and found out 6 months later that the neighbors all got together to ask what it would be like to have to live near the pastor. What if they hear us arguing? What if they hear their kids are probably perfect, right? And it's always a rude awakening when they realize that I'm married to a therapist, so we argue a lot, and it's one of our love languages, and we got kids who are kids, they're kids. So it just, I think there's something about letting people know that what is trustworthy is I show up and do my job, the things you've entrusted to me to do, and I am the same person in that spot. And that's enough. That's a lot, but that's enough to begin to then take people into adaptive change. And adaptive change starts, that trust, think about that trust, as it creates a container to hold the heat necessary for transformation. So that trust is what Ronald Heifetz calls a holding environment. It's a set of relationships that can handle us to have whatever conflict is needed to be able to begin to bring transformation. So the analogy is one of a crock pot, right? So if you've ever cooked things in a crock pot, I don't very often, but usually I do. It's because I want to go play outside and I want to leave something. I'm going to go skiing, and so I want to leave something there to cook all day long so I can come back and there's dinner. And it means that it has to be safe enough to handle the heat. so that I can know that it's okay. And the whole point is your relational congruence and your technical competence creates the walls of the holding environment that you can put in the meat and vegetables and whatever liquid you choose, and I'm Italian, and you can fill that up and put in spices, and if you have the right amount of heat over the right amount of time, it transforms and it becomes a meal, and it's a feast that everybody can eat, and it nourishes many. But if you have it too cool, it's not going to cook. You can't set a crock pot at 1 degree above room temperature for as long as it takes to cook it and expect it to cook. It will spoil before it cooks. And many of our churches have that kind of toxicity in them. We don't have a capacity to handle anything. Some of it is based on us. Let's face it. We walk around getting a lot of strokes for making everybody calm down. I always say that if this is the pure DNA you want to make sure that you keep, this is the thing you want to be careful to avoid. If you find yourself going into every room going, hey, everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be great. Hey, just by the way, here, come together, calm down. Then what you're probably doing is taking your own anxiety and trying to shove it down. And if you can't handle that heat, nothing's going to transform. You've got to get it to the place where it's uncomfortable enough that people begin to transform, but not so uncomfortable that they bail out. So it has to be hot enough to bring transformation without getting so hot that it scorches. And when things scorch, and some of you have been in churches like that, right? Somebody came in before you as the person who's going to bring change, and they cranked up the heat. And people have experienced that, or some pastor who was there who believed that it was their responsibility to lead us into the 21st century, and they cranked up the heat. And what you got is a whole bunch of people walking around with this bitter taste in their mouth because it's scorched and it burned. And trying to get that burn taste out of something, you can add as much cream and sugar as you want. It's still there. And everybody tastes it. They might tolerate it, but they taste it. And for many of us, our communities are like that. Someone either burned them before, or someone so anxiously calmed them down for so long that they're either toxic or they're burnt. And what you've got to do, in many cases, that is the most painful part of all of that, is how do you actually start to change the ingredients so that it can become a healthy place. But heat is about urgency and anxiety and conflict. It's what Ignatius calls a moderate level of anxiety. It's actually in the prayers of St. Ignatius. It's interesting. He literally says there's a moderate level of anxiety that God wants us to have. He basically talks about it as a kind of a restlessness and an awareness, a kind of being troubled. It's being irked. Somebody asked me earlier today, like how do you feel when people give you irks? I said, irks is usually where stuff's alive, right? Because it's bugging me. It's probably something God's doing with me. And maybe I'm bugged at you about it, but really, you're going to go home, and I'm going to have to go home with this irk. And so, there's something about that tension that is really important, and there's a kind of a moderate level of anxiety. Not so anxious that we can't tolerate it, and not so calm. In certain circles, you hear people say, your job is to be the non-anxious presence in the room. You ever heard that phrase? The non-anxious presence in the room is the corpse. Only dead people are non-anxious. That means you're at a funeral and that's the one in the box, right? It's every one of us. The goal isn't to be the non-anxious person. To me, the goal is to be the least anxious person, right? I have enough anxiety. I can handle the heat, but I'm okay sitting here in the middle of it. And let's just also be clear that the more your life has been comfortable, the more that you have had power, the more that you've had privilege, the more that you have had status, then you probably have the least amount of tolerance for the heat, right? I've been in so many settings where somebody just says a prophetic word and then somebody else turns around and it's like, oh, I'm so insulted. And I'm like, you didn't get hurt by that. It's like, they're like, oh my gosh, that's burning me. No, actually, that was just fire that went near you. You're perfectly fine, right? So partly it's learning what to do with that. So think of healthy conflict as steady, consistent heat that we're working over all the time. Holding the amount of discomfort in the room that continually move people through. And just remember, people who have the power or people who have the security are always going to feel that any discomfort is too much heat. So remember, you don't have your hand on the thermostat. You don't get to control the heat this way. You are the thermostat. You control the heat by what you can tolerate. If you can sit there in the room and be okay and smile and be all right and say, look, this is hard. This is really challenging to me too, but I think there's something happening here. We need to hear that voice. We need to make sure that to consider this option. We need to make sure that we are listening to the people around us, that we are non-defensive when people come, and talk about the ways in which we need to make an impact. And be also okay with not letting people be bullies, not letting people hurt other people, right? It's creating the holding environment. So point number one, right? People don't resist change, they resist loss. Number two, for transformation to endure, it has to be a healthy adaptation of your core DNA. And number three, which is related to this, you have not succeeded until you've survived the sabotage. Ed Friedman literally said, if you're a leader, expect sabotage. So let me talk about what we mean by sabotage. Here's another one of those long quotes by Friedman that I'll give you, which is reason for downloading the slides alone. The important thing to remember about the phenomena of sabotage, Ed Friedman says, is that it is a systemic part of leadership. It's part and parcel of the leadership process. Another way of putting this is that a leader can never assume success because he or she has brought about a change. It's only after having first brought about a change, then subsequently endured the resultant sabotage, that the leader can feel truly successful. Notice what Friedman's saying here. If you're going to bring change, the first step is you bring the change. Then, now you go through the sabotage. Now you're actually doing adaptive leadership. We Presbyterians believe that if we can get enough votes in a Robert's Rules of Order perfectly called vote, then, the kingdom of God would come. Like, all in favor, say aye. Aye. Motion carries. We are now of the kingdom of God. And the problem we don't get is that you can win the votes and still not be a long way away from change. Because change is about transformation, right? Talk to any of our African American brothers and sisters about how long it's taken for the Emancipation Proclamation to become reality, right? It's a long, long time for actual transformation to happen. And so for us to recognize that notion is really, really important. So I told you about 2 weeks after 9/11. And about how we had this congregational meeting. And actually, we found later that someone had a camcorder and actually videoed it. This is before there were cell phones with videos, so to have a videotape, it was amazing. And we had this camcorder that somebody videotaped when I'm standing there in front of this congregation, and I'm all of like 37 years old, and I'm basically calling for the vote, all in favor of tearing down all of our buildings, and you're paying for it, so that we can carry out the vision that we say aye, and everybody went aye. And I turned around and said, opposed, motion carries unanimously, and everybody burst into applause. And we had this great moment. It was we captured it on videotape. We'd show it over and over again. I'd tell people about it in our new members classes. So 6 months go by, and we are now starting into the capital campaign, and we're moving through, and we're starting with building plans, and the capital campaign's halfway through. And my business administrator comes to me and says, so Todd, I got a question to ask you. If we don't raise the money, what's plan B? I went, what do you mean? He goes, if we get into it and if it doesn't work, what would we do? I mean, I look at him like, what do you mean it's not going to work? We took a vote and everybody agreed. I laid it out perfectly. I told them, you're paying for it. We told them how much it was. We've been consistent. Everybody agreed along the way. Session voted on it. The congregation voted on it. We got the presbytery to approve it. Every step along the way. So what do you mean? He said, well, I just wonder whether or not we're going to be able to raise the money. I said, well, we have a consultant who told us we have the capacity to raise the money. He said, yeah, but I'm not sure it's going to all come in. And I went, what are you saying? And he goes, well, Jay? Yeah. Everybody knew Jay. Jay was not only the wealthiest man in our church, he was one of the wealthiest men in our town. And everybody assumed that Jay would be one of the people who would write one of the big checks. He said, well, I don't think Jay's into this. I said, I was in the room. I watched. Jay voted for this. He said, well, I think we need to examine that. You see, now, if you ever watch like a professional football game or something, and now they have slow motion replays, I'm convinced that if we had a camera there that could do a slow motion replay, what we would have had at that moment with the camcorder going off when I'm calling for the vote, that we wouldn't have seen until later under further review, would have been basically something like this. All in favor of tearing down our buildings and you're paying for it, say aye, and you would have watched the entire congregation do this. Aye. Because everybody looked at Jay. And Jay slipped his hand up. And everybody went, well, if he's in, this is going to be great. And so they all voted for it. But what we came to find out is that Jay actually wasn't very happy about it at all. You see, what nobody had told me was Jay had been the contractor 30 years earlier who had built the very building that we were sitting in. And that Jay made his money in construction, and that Jay was famous for having said, don't worry, I'll make sure the city council and the city commission signs off on all this. We'll just get it done. So when I stood in front of the congregation, not knowing that that was Jay, and I said, these buildings are completely out of code because too many people cut corners and they were not done in the way that would be honoring to God. So we're going to have to tear them down. The whole congregation looked at Jay, and when Jay just sat there quietly and raised his hand, they all went, oh, that must be great. Todd and Jay must have worked this out, and this is terrific, and we're all in favor. And what we found out later is that Jay sat there stewing and embarrassed, knew everybody was looking at him, and he wasn't going to give anybody the satisfaction, so he slipped his hand up and voted for it, went home, grabbed his pinochle buddies, they all got together, and they all decided this, we're all going to give $1,000. And we're going to give $1,000, so if anybody asks us, we can say we've been all in favor. Jay could write a check for $1 million. At least that's what our capital campaign consultant figured out. We're going to give $1,000, and they're going to, and this is literally what they said, so we can watch that boy from Los Angeles fall on his ass. He called me boy too. The point to recognize is this is a classic idea of sabotage. We passed the vote, now we have resistance. Now, two things. Number one, it's kind of unconscious sabotage by a number of the people who are around the church who didn't think to tell the new pastor that he shouldn't run down the buildings in front of the guy who built it, because I didn't know. And the second was, even after I'd done it and said it, people decided they didn't want to embarrass me, so they didn't tell me what I'd said or done. And so it took until that very moment to realize how much I had actually insulted him. So when Jay decides that he's not going to not only not participate, but he doesn't want to be called out or embarrassed any further, so he will both raise his hand and he'll write a check for $1,000 while secretly hoping that it will fail miserably so that I will go back to where I came from, he is doing what is normal, what is natural, what is to be expected. Sabotage is not the bad things that evil people do. Sabotage is the human things that anxious people do. He was anxious, he was fearful, he wondered what people thought of him, he got his feelings hurt. Now, to be clear, Jay and I didn't have really the best relationship for the next few years. He was famous for being a duck hunter, and he used to hand-carve ducks, and he gave basically everybody at the church a duck except me. Like all my staff would all, hey, I got a duck from Jay. And like, no, I got my duck from Jay. And I'd be sitting there going, Jay's not talking to me. And fortunately, we had an associate pastor on our staff who developed a good relationship with him, and she really pastored him, and they stayed in the life of the church. And people would come to me, especially afterwards, and when my business administrator said, I don't know if we'll make this capital campaign without him. And what we basically said is, look, God knows. We're going to be faithful. We'll find out what it is, and we'll see what happens, but we're not going to treat Jay any differently. No shaming, no blaming, nothing. We're just going to care for him. And the truth of the matter is he needs to be part of this church. This is his church, whether he participates in this campaign at all. We went through the campaign. We were able to get enough money to do the building project, and I don't think Jay gave us any money the rest of his life of any significance. But he stayed there his whole career, his whole life. And he stayed there, and that was his church. But his own anxious sabotaging became contagious to people like my business administrator. Friedman puts it this way: a major difficulty in sustaining one's mission is that others who start out with the same enthusiasm will come to lose their nerve. Mutiny and sabotage come not from enemies who oppose the initial idea, but rather from colleagues whose will was sapped by unexpected hardships along the way. And some of you know this, right? The search committee that brought you here to bring change are the people who are all too tired to keep going. The very same staff that said, we're with you, are the people who, when things get really tough, start asking you, telling you that you're moving too fast. Or the very people who you've tried to convince, hey, it's important that we bring people along at the right amount of pace, they sabotage you by turning up the heat so hot that it ends up scorching people. Anything that moves against the mission that you're trying to accomplish is a kind of sabotage, including self-sabotage. So what do you do? What do you do when you're trying to remain consistent to bring change, especially in the face of sabotage? This goes back to the Lombard Peace Institute. Stay calm, stay connected, and stay the course. Once you have a conviction that this is the thing to do, once you're clear, here's our core DNA, and here's how it applies in mission. Here's the way our church needs to continue to change to live out our mission. Once we have a clear strategic direction, and then as I wrote in 2013, before I realized that could be a controversial phrase, the mission trumps. Once you have a sense that you have a direction that you're heading, then it's really about holding on to the mission. It's really not about the pastor's priority or the people in power. It's about there's this thing that we are called to do, and this is what it is, and this is our DNA and who we are. And for us to live out our vision and our DNA in this setting and in this circumstance in this way, this mission we're going to continue. For us, it meant tearing down our buildings. Today, it probably wouldn't mean that in most places. For Fuller Seminary, it's meant having to grapple with whether or not we've thought about moving our campus. And we put our entire campus for sale and was prepared to move, only to find out that our buyers have fallen out and we may not be able to move. And right now, we're in the middle of this time where Fuller Seminary is having to grapple with, we're not even sure where we're going to be in 3 years. But we still have to continue our mission of educating and forming leaders around the world. That notion of not letting hardships get in the way of sapping the will and sabotaging you. Stay calm, manage your own anxiety, manage your own reactivity. Stay connected, stay in relationship. Jay wasn't that interested in staying connected to me, but he stayed connected to our pastoral team. And over time, what became really helpful about that was that by staying connected, he could still stay part of the congregation and then stay the course. What's really important is when you're convinced that this is the direction that God wants us to go, when you're convinced together, when it's not just one idea, when it's been tested and discerned and worked over, then be ready for the fact that it will hit resistance. So when you have a choice, continue on. Stay the course. Stay at it. If it proves to be wrong, if it proves to be something that you've got wrong-headed, trust that God who loves you will throw something bigger in your way, right? God can make a donkey talk to you. God can do something else, right? But there's a need for us to continue to choose to stay at it, to stay the course, to push through the resistance, not in a bludgeoning, bullying kind of way, but in a determined, discerning way. So we did our building campaign, and Jay stayed in our congregation. And at the end of his life, he came and visited me, and he brought me a duck. And when he passed away, he asked if I would be, right before he passed away, if I would be one of the people who officiated his funeral. And so me and the other pastor, who had really been his pastor through the years when he didn't feel very connected to me, co-officiated it together. And we never got an extra dime out of him, but he stayed with us. And it was important, I think, for many in our congregation to recognize that not only was it great that Jay could stay with that young buck he didn't like very much, but that the church had room for a guy like Jay who didn't really like very much of what they were doing. That the church was bigger than that. Stay calm, stay connected, stay the course. Sabotage is normal, it's natural, it's to be expected. So the fourth principle is that everybody will be changed, especially the leaders. And part of the way that you and I are going to be changed is we need to become the kinds of people who can take on the kind of strength and flexibility, both, to be able to lead people through their own disappointment, to lead congregations to where they need to go and want to go and resist going, to take people further than they ever imagined and to create something new that they never even thought was possible. For me, one of the great examples of this comes out of one of my favorite speeches ever. You know it, I'm sure, as well. It's the I Have a Dream speech of Martin Luther King. To know a bit about the background of that speech, obviously it was done on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in August of 1963, and when he was sitting there prepared to give that speech, the speeches had gone all day long. Martin Luther King got up to speak right before he did. Mahalia Jackson sang a couple of gospel spirituals that literally, they wrote later, was the high point of the day. It brought the people together. And King gets up to speak, and he had worked all night long on his speech. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say. He gathered a group of people, including Clarence B. Jones, and they worked all night long, and they decided that the speech would be about the way in which the American people had given a check, a promissory note, to the African American citizens that had been returned insufficient funds. That you had an entire group of citizens in our country who had not experienced the thing that they had been promised. And that he had this entire kind of prophetic, indicting, truth-telling, difficult metaphor about the way in which the way in which the African American people in our culture had experienced a century of a bad check. And what they said later, what folks said, Clarence B. Jones and others said later, is he was laying out this very scholarly, measured, clear argument. He stumbled on a line. And when he stumbled on the line, he looked up, and something let him know that the crowd wasn't entirely with him. And Mahalia Jackson behind him whispered to him, "Martin, tell him about the dream." And Clarence B. Jones says later, "At that moment I knew we were going to church." And he launches into a riff on Isaiah 40. I have a dream that at one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made a plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, this Isaiah 40 faith, this faith that someday that the world will be changed, that there will be justice, and the glory of the Lord will be seen, he preaches from the Lincoln Memorial. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, with this Isaiah 40 faith, he says, we'll be able to hew out of a mountain of despair stone of hope. I don't know about you, and I can't hear about stones and stones of hope without thinking 1 Peter, and about how Jesus is the cornerstone and how we are to be the living stones, and about how the very glory of God and the presence of God will be seen here. So to think about the fact that this imagery of how the glory of God is seen where we hew stones of hope out of mountains of despair, and that the transformation from despair to hope creates the building that will become the dwelling place in the people of God for the glory of God is a beautiful image for me. So to ask the question, how do we become a tool that can hew stone? Friedman would say that the most single biggest attribute of leaders who are trying to bring this kind of change is that they have persistence in the face of resistance. They have what we would describe as being resilient, a kind of resilience to be able to stay in the middle of resistance. That when they hit the mountain of despair that comes, that sits there not wanting to change, they will continue to not be a sledgehammer that smashes their way through, but instead becomes a chisel that transforms the despair by click into stones of hope. Now for me, what's interesting about this is because of having done this work on Canoeing the Mountains and been to all these different churches and places to talk about it, I started asking this question. So what kind of characteristics does it take? I mean, I can tell you the techniques, I can give you some of the skills, I can send you home with stories to do and exercises to do, but I know the struggle isn't going to be gathering people in stories and talking about our core values. It's not even going to be listening to our neighbors and saying we should do something about that. And it's not going to be actually getting people together who are energized to try change. What's going to be hard is how you stay in it when you start to bring change and people resist and you start to despair. And that resilience is what is necessary to be able to bring transformation. So I began to look at some of the leadership literature, about what does the leadership literature say about people who can bring change. And I also began to look at the scripture passages and the theological literature about the attributes of people who lead change. And I began to see that there was this kind of overwhelming synergy, that there's a similarity between kind of the spiritual formation and the leadership development language that shows up in characteristics like this. That if you're going to be a person who is a spiritually formed leader in almost every tradition, you have at least three things. Identity in Christ. Your identity is rooted in Christ and not the people around you. That you are committed to Christ and you have an identity that is bigger than the circumstance you're in. That you have a humility, that you are open to learning. That Moses was the greatest leader of Israel, but the most humble man in all the earth. And that you have the capacity for perseverance, hupomone, forbearance, endurance. In leadership development literature, it shows up really similarly, the same way. Self-differentiation, your capacity to be in a group and not be sucked up in the emotions of the group. To be an I in the middle of a system who is able to withstand the peer pressure of the we. To be able to be disappointing without being disconnecting. To be people who are emotionally intelligent, who are self-aware about themselves, able to manage their relationships and manage their reactivity, who are able to be socially competent with other people and able to manage relationships with others in a system, who are more attuned relationally, that EQ is actually more important than IQ when it comes to leading. That intelligence gets you your first job and emotional intelligence is what gets you into leadership positions. And that resilience shows up as often as perseverance. So in all of these, you find these qualities. You find these qualities of people who are teachable, humble, attuned, emotionally attuned to other people, adaptable, able to have core values, but to be able to hold them humbly and not have to be so stubborn about them, and tenacious, have a kind of perseverance. But it's all rooted in a kind of grounded identity. And here's what I mean by the grounded identity. The key capacity of a leader to bring change is that your identity has to be grounded in something bigger than the change. That your identity has to be grounded in something that is disconnected from the very thing you're trying to accomplish. That you need to know that you are good and loved before you've done anything, just like Jesus did. Before Jesus had done a single thing as Messiah, he heard the voice, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Before we can do anything else, before we've led anything, accomplished anything, or done anything, our identity must be rooted in something bigger than our leadership. I experienced this firsthand when I was in the middle of a time in my life when a pal and I were doing a lot of running and riding, and we decided that for a few years, and I had a sabbatical, we would train to do an Ironman. Who's like two big guys doing this really long day. You swim for a couple of miles, and then you ride your bike for like over 100, and then when the end of that, you run a marathon. And it took us 14 hours. But the day before we did it, we end up at this event, and there's all these uber fit people, all competing, all trying to become world champions. They're the most annoying people on the planet. And they're all, and we're just, we're just like two big guys who just liked going out for long bike rides. And we're showing up at this dinner, and they're having a big pasta feed the night before the event. And then they call up a person to speak. And the person they called up, they said, "We brought a person up who's going to speak, and she's a religious person, and she's going to actually give us a little prayer. So would you invite her to come up?" And she walks up, and she's Madonna Buter, who's a nun who they called Iron Nun. She is the world record holder in her age group, everything over 75 for women, doing the Ironman. And so this small, wiry little woman gets up in front of all these people and says, they've asked me to pray for the meal and to pray for you. And here's what I want to say before we say anything else. You're all very competitive people. You're very accomplished. And tomorrow could be a very hard day. Some of you will have all your dreams come true, and others of you could have a dashing, difficult day. And what I want you to remember more than anything else is before you do a single thing, no matter what happens tomorrow, remember this: you were loved into existence. You were loved into existence, she said to all these people who had no idea that they were showing up in church. And I believe that to be a grounded leader, you have to start with knowing that you were loved into existence. That your call to lead does not necessarily guarantee your success. That you might be part of something that God wants to do in your congregation, that you are only one part of the longer journey, but that your job is to be faithful and vigilant and to lead people through, and that it is not your job to know whether or not it's going to be finished well. To do so, we need to be people who can stay calm and stay connected and stay the course. It's going to go through sabotage and conflict. And your capacity to take people through conflict is going to be the key characteristic. I'm going to stop here. We're going to take a brief break. We're going to take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 2:15, and then I'm going to wrap up with our final session where we start to ask the question, what are the characteristics that develop this kind of resilience and this characteristics? And then we'll end with some Q&A, and we'll be finished for the day on time. So just take a brief break, take 10 minutes or so, and we'll be back again around 2:15.